The year was 1879, and the wind was king. It was a high plains wind, born somewhere over the jagged teeth of the distant mountains, and it swept across the vast, open country with a restless, tireless fury. It carried the scent of sun-baked earth, dry sage, and the faint, mineral tang of a land that had forgotten the taste of rain. On the road to the town of Sagebrush, the wind was a visible thing, a churning, swirling force that lifted the fine red dust from the rutted track and spun it into dancing devils that writhed and dissipated against the endless blue sky. The dust was a constant companion, a gritty powder that settled on everything, coating the sparse, hardy grass, clinging to the weathered bark of the few struggling cottonwoods, and finding its way into the very fabric of life. It was the color of old blood and new rust, and it painted the world in a monochrome of weary endurance. Through this relentless haze of red rode Coulter Hayes. He sat his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Gideon, with the easy, bone-deep familiarity of a man who had spent more time in the saddle than out of it. He was a man shaped by the land he worked, all hard lines and quiet economy of motion. A thick layer of the ubiquitous red dust covered his worn denim trousers and his patched chambray shirt. Settling into the creases at his elbows and the back of his neck, his hat, a stained and battered Stetson, was pulled low, its wide brim casting a deep shadow over his face, hiding his eyes from the glare of the afternoon sun. All that was visible beneath the shadow was a square jaw covered in a week's worth of dark stubble and a mouth set in a firm, uncommunicative line. He was leading a pack mule, burdened with heavy canvas sacks of salt, their weight a solid, reassuring presence behind him. The salt was for his cattle, a necessity in this parched land. Another small victory in the ongoing war against the elements. He was heading home to the Dry Run Ranch, a name that had become more of a prophecy than a description in recent months. The town of Sagebrush was a collection of raw, unpainted wooden buildings huddled together as if for protection against the vast emptiness that surrounded them. It had a main street, wide enough to turn a wagon team, flanked by a general store, a blacksmith's forge, a small, steepled church, and the inevitable saloon. From the swinging doors of the saloon, the tinny, melancholic notes of a poorly tuned piano drifted out, a fragile human sound quickly snatched and shredded by the wind. Coulter rode past it without a glance. He had his salt, he had his work, the town and its comforts, such as they were, held little appeal for him. His world was the wide, lonely expanse of the dry run, the familiar weight of a tool in his hand, the lowing of his cattle at dusk. It was a solitary existence, and the silence had long since become his most constant companion. He was a few miles out of town, where the road dipped into a shallow arroyo carved by forgotten flash floods, when he saw it, pulled over at an awkward, unnatural angle, hard up against a craggy outcrop of weathered rock, was a small, canvas-topped wagon. It was a buckboard, really too small for a long-haul freight run, perhaps belonging to a tinker or a traveler just passing through. One of the rear wheels was jammed into a deep rut, tilted at a sickening angle, even from a distance. Coulter could see the problem. The wheel hadn't just sunk, it had failed. A handful of wooden spokes had splintered and snapped, their jagged ends pointing accusingly at the sky. The buckboard was hopelessly stuck, a broken-winged bird grounded in a sea of dust. A figure stood beside the crippled vehicle, one hand resting on the damaged wheel. It was a woman. She was wrapped in a large, drab-colored shawl that covered her head and shoulders, protecting her from the sun and the stinging, dust-laden wind. Her dress, visible beneath the shawl, was dark and practical, but Coulter could see the fine layer of red dust that had settled upon it, dulling its color. She seemed small and out of place against the raw, immense landscape. Coulter reined in Gideon, the horse letting out a low snort and shaking its head, jingling the harness. The pack mule stopped behind him, its ears twitching. He sat for a long moment, watching. Trouble on the road was common enough, but it was usually a thrown shoe or a lame horse. A broken wheel this far from town was a more serious matter. The wind whipped a loose end of the woman's shawl across her face, and she pushed it back with a gesture that spoke of weary frustration. He nudged Gideon forward, the horse's hooves making soft, muffled sounds in the thick dust. As he drew closer, he saw that she was not as frail as she had first appeared. There was a sturdiness to her stance, a resilience in the set of her shoulders. Her hands, resting on the wagon, were bare. They were slender, but they were not the soft, pale hands of a town lady. They were smudged with grease from the axle and darkened by the fine red dust. She had been trying to fix it herself. When she heard his approach, she turned, and for the first time, he saw her face. The shawl had slipped back, revealing dark hair pulled into a tight, functional bun. Though wisps had escaped to dance in the wind, her face was smudged with dirt, and there was a streak of grease across one cheekbone. But it was her eyes that held him. They were a clear, startling blue, and in their depths, there was no fear or helplessness, but rather a bright, sharp intelligence and a flicker of deep-seated exasperation. She watched him approach, her expression wary but not afraid. He stopped Gideon a few feet away, looking from her to the broken wheel and back again. The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the sighing of the wind and the creak of his leather saddle. "Looks like you found some trouble," he said finally. His voice was rough from disuse, a low baritone that seemed to be scraped from the dry earth itself. The woman's lips curved into a wry, tired smile. "You could say that. I believe the technical term is stranded." Her own voice was clear and steady, with a crisp, educated cadence that was as out of place here as a spring lily. It was a voice that belonged in a classroom or a quiet library, not on a dusty road in the middle of nowhere. He swung down from the saddle, his boots sinking into the soft dust. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried grace, every action measured and purposeful. He walked over to the wagon and crouched down, running a calloused hand over the splintered spokes. The damage was severe. The wheel would need to be completely rebuilt, a job for a blacksmith, not a roadside repair. "Spokes are gone," he stated, his voice flat and factual. "Can't fix this here." "I'd reached the same conclusion," she said, her tone dry. "Unfortunately, my expertise in wheelwrighting is somewhat limited. My attempts to persuade the wheel to heal itself have thus far been unsuccessful." Despite the situation, a hint of amusement played in her eyes. Coulter glanced up at her from under the brim of his hat. He wasn't used to women who made jokes when faced with predicament. He wasn't used to women at all. Not anymore. He stood up, wiping his dusty hands on his trousers. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "To Sagebrush. I have a position there." What kind of position? The question was blunt, born of a pragmatism that saw no need for pleasantries. The woman straightened her shoulders, a flicker of pride in her bright eyes. "I'm a bookbinder by trade, but I've been hired to serve as the town's temporary school teacher. My name is Tessa Rowan." "A teacher?" Coulter processed the information slowly. He'd heard talk of it, some of the town councilmen wanting to put together a proper school for the children of the ranchers and shopkeepers. Most of them ran wild, their education limited to what their overworked parents could spare the time to teach them. He hadn't given it much thought. It had nothing to do with him or the dry run. He looked at Tessa Rowan again. A bookbinder, a teacher. She was in creature of paper and ink, of quiet rooms and ordered words. What was she doing in a place like this? A place that broke wagons and spirits with equal indifference. He gave a short, curt nod. Coulter Hayes. He offered no more. No explanation of who he was or what he did. His name was enough. He turned his attention back to the wagon, while the wheel itself was beyond his ability to repair. The immediate problem was getting the buckboard movable. He surveyed the surrounding area, his gaze scanning the rocky arroyo. He spotted a long, sturdy-looking piece of fallen timber a short distance away, half buried in the sand and scrub. Without another word, he walked over to it, tested its weight, and then heaved it onto his shoulder. He carried it back to the wagon, the muscles in his back and shoulders bunching under his thin shirt. He jammed one end of the timber under the wagon's rear axle, then looked for a fulcrum, settling on a flat, solid-looking rock. He positioned it carefully. A lever. It was a simple machine, a basic principle of physics. But out here, it was the kind of practical knowledge that meant the difference between survival and starvation. "I'm going to lift the axle," he said, his voice a low grunt of effort as he put his weight on the end of the makeshift lever. "You'll need to guide the wheel. Try to get it back into the rut, straight as you can. It won't roll, but we might be able to drag the wagon if the axle is clear of the ground." Tessa nodded, her earlier weariness replaced by a focused intensity. She gathered her skirts in one hand and knelt in the dust, her shawl falling back from her head. She wrapped both hands around the heavy, broken wheel, her fingers finding purchase on the iron rim. She watched him, waiting. Coulter took a deep breath and then threw his full weight onto the lever. The timber groaned in protest, the muscles in his arms and back strained, the veins standing out like thick cords under his sun-darkened skin. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, agonizingly, the heavy axle began to lift. Tessa could feel the shift, the transfer of weight as the wagon rose. The groaning of the wood was a visceral sound, the sound of immense effort and resistance. Her heart began to beat in a heavy, steady rhythm that seemed to match the straining pulse of the man and the wood. A primal beat of exertion against inertia. "Now," he grunted, his voice tight with the strain. Tessa pushed with all her might. The wheel was heavy, awkward. Dust and grit rained down on her as it scraped against the side of the rut. She gritted her teeth, her own muscles straining, her hands raw against the rough iron. She could feel the tremors of Coulter's effort traveling through the frame of the wagon. She looked at him, his face a mask of concentration. His jaw clenched, the shadow of his hat unable to hide the sweat beating on his temples. In that moment, he was a creature of pure, focused strength, a part of the harsh landscape itself. From the direction of town, the faint clatter of another rider could be heard, but neither of them paid it any mind. They were locked in their own small world, a world defined by the weight of the wagon, the resistance of the earth, and the shared, silent effort to overcome it. Meanwhile, back in Sagebrush, a pair of men had stepped out of the saloon for a smoke, their eyes squinting against the bright sunlight. They watched the distant figures on the road, small and indistinct in the shimmering heat haze. "Is that Hayes?" one of them asked, a lanky man with a drooping mustache. The other, a portly merchant named Abernathy, nodded. "Looks like him. Looks like he's found himself some company." "A woman," the first man noted, a smirk playing on his lips. "Well, didn't think he had it in him anymore." Abernathy took a long drag from his cigarette, his expression more thoughtful, tinged with a hint of pity. "Don't be so sure. Coulter Hayes. He has a way of losing things. Can't seem to keep anything or anyone close. Remember that pretty little singer who was supposed to be his fiancée headed east on the stagecoach without so much as a goodbye? Left him with nothing but a half-finished house and a whole lot of silence. The man can't hold on to people any better than he can hold on to water for his cattle. Everything he touches seems to dry up and blow away." The lanky man grunted, a sound of cynical agreement. "He can't keep nothing," he repeated. The bad grammar a casual testament to the town's general assessment. Not cattle, not people. They watched for another moment as Coulter and Tessa, two small figures locked in a struggle against the indifferent landscape, finally managed to wrench the broken wheel into a more stable position. Then, they flicked their cigarettes into the dust and retreated back into the cool, dim sanctuary of the saloon. With a final, jarring scrape, the wheel settled into the rut. The wagon, though still crippled, was now at least upright. Coulter eased the pressure on the lever, letting the axle settle back down. He was breathing heavily, the air hissing between his teeth. He straightened up, rolling his shoulders to work out the strain. He looked at Tessa. She was still kneeling in the dust, her hands resting on the now stable wheel. Her face was flushed with exertion, and a strand of dark hair had fallen across her forehead, sticking to her damp skin. She looked up at him, her blue eyes bright with a mixture of relief and something else, something he couldn't quite decipher. "Thank you," she said, her voice a little breathless. Coulter just nodded. He walked back to his horse and untied a length of thick rope from his saddle. He returned to the wagon and expertly looped it around the front axle, then secured the other end to his saddle horn. "It'll be a slow drag," he said, his tone all business. "But it'll get you to the blacksmith. He didn't offer to take her horse or lead the wagon himself. He had his own load, his own destination. He had helped. That was enough." He swung himself back up onto Gideon's back, the movement fluid and economical. He looked down at her, his face once again an unreadable mask of shadow beneath his hat brim. "Go slow on the turn into town," he said. It was not advice. It was a command, a simple, practical instruction. With that, he nudged Gideon, and the horse, taking the strain of the rope, began to walk. The pack mule followed, and Coulter Hayes rode away, heading out onto the open plains, away from town, toward the dry run. He didn't look back. He left behind him nothing but a set of tracks in the dust and the faint, lingering scent of horse sweat and salt. Tessa Rowan slowly got to her feet, brushing the thick red dust from her hands and her dress. It was a futile gesture. The dust was everywhere. She watched his retreating figure, a solitary man against a vast, empty horizon. She noted the straightness of his back, the steady, unhurried pace of his horse. He was a man who seemed to carry his loneliness not as a burden, but as a familiar, worn-in coat. She looked at the rope, a tangible link between her broken wagon and his silent strength. In her mind, a place accustomed to ordering words and binding pages. She made a quiet, certain note that quiet, solitary man would be back. She didn't know how or why, but she knew it with the certainty of a well-told story reaching its inevitable next chapter. She climbed onto the driver's seat of her crippled wagon, took up the reins of her own patient horse, and, with a soft cluck, started the slow, grinding journey into sagebrush. As she neared the first buildings, she saw the town's public notice board, nailed to the weathered wood. Amongst advertisements for patent medicines and notices of a town social was a freshly printed poster. The ink was dark and stark against the white paper. The heading, in thick, bold letters, read, "Notice of intent to foreclose." Beneath it, the precise, legalistic language of Crowell's Bank laid out the terms. It listed a number of local properties, ranches that were falling behind on their loan payments due to the persistent drought. The bank, it stated, would be seizing any and all assets from ranches that could not demonstrate adequate water resources by the end of the season. Her eyes scanned the list of names, and near the bottom, she saw it Dry Run Ranch. Proprietor Coulter Hayes. The wind gusted, flapping the corner of the notice, the sound like a dry, mocking laugh. The old grain warehouse, granted to Tessa by a town council eager to offload a derelict property, smelled of 100 forgotten harvests. Dust motes, thick as summer gnats, danced in the shafts of light that pierced the gloom through gaps in the shingled roof. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood, mice, and the faint, ghostly sweetness of spilled grain. Tessa, with her sleeves rolled up to her elbows and a kerchief tied over her hair, attacked the space with a determined fury. She swept away thick cobwebs that clung like shrouds and shoveled out years of accumulated dust and debris. The town had provided a few rough-hewn benches, a rickety table for her desk, and a large slate blackboard, its surface scarred and grayed with age. The chalk they gave her was brittle. It broke in half the first time she tried to write her name. This was to be her school. It was not the quiet, book-lined study of her dreams, but it was a beginning. And in a place like Sagebrush, beginnings were hard-won and precious. Her students arrived the next morning, a straggling, curious flock of children ranging in age from 6 to 12. They came with patched trousers, dirt-smudged faces, and eyes that were by turns shy and defiant. They were the children of ranchers, blacksmiths, and storekeepers, their hands already calloused from chores, their knowledge of the world rooted in the practicalities of branding irons and canning seasons, not in the abstract beauty of letters. They shuffled into the dim warehouse, their boots scuffing on the newly swept floorboards, and stared at the blackboard as if it were an artifact from another world. They sat on the splintery benches, some wiggling with nervous energy, others still as prairie dogs sensing a hawk. Tessa looked at their faces young, weathered before their time, yet filled with an untamed spark, and felt a profound sense of purpose settle over her. These were the minds she had come to cultivate, miles away, under the same unforgiving sun. Coulter Hayes was engaged in his own bleak accounting. He stood in the cool, hay-scented dimness of his barn, the vast structure a testament to a time of greater hope. He ran a hand over a stack of hay bales, counting them for the 10th time that week, as if the number might magically increase. It never did. The hay was for winter feed, but he was already having to use it to supplement the parched grazing land. Each bale he broke open was a tick of a clock counting down to a future he couldn't afford. He walked to the wide barn doors and looked out at his land. The dry run, the creek that gave his ranch its name and its life, was now just a meandering ribbon of cracked, sun-baked mud. A few stagnant pools of murky water remained, but they were shrinking daily. The windmill turned slowly, its blades catching the hot, dry wind, but the squeak from its pump was labored, a thirsty sound. The bill for the salt he'd bought in town sat on his kitchen table, its stark black figures a bitter taste in the back of his throat. Every cent he spent was a gamble against the sky, a bet that the June rains would come. That afternoon, the town's most prosperous and least liked citizen, Mr. Elias Crowell, stood on the boardwalk outside his bank. He was a man whose softness was a kind of armor, his round belly and smooth, pale hands a stark contrast to the hard, sun-beaten men he held in his debt. He watched Coulter Hayes ride into town for supplies, a solitary, dust-covered figure. Crowell smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. He spoke to his clerk, a nervous young man named Peterson who was sweeping the boardwalk. Look at him, Peterson, another one who thinks he can beat the land by sheer stubbornness. Crowell took a silver dollar from his waistcoat pocket, flipping it and catching it with a practiced flick of the wrist. Stubbornness doesn't fill a creek bed. If the June rains don't come on time, that land, all of it, will belong to the bank. And I assure you, I have a much better use for it. The silver dollar glinted in the sun before disappearing back into his pocket. A small, final judgment. Tessa's day was measured in small victories. She coaxed a shy 7-year-old girl named Sarah to say her own name aloud. She showed a boy named Ben, whose hands were more accustomed to mending fences, how to hold a piece of chalk without snapping it. By midday, the heat in the warehouse was stifling. She declared a short recess, and the children, with a whoop of joy, scrambled outside to the town's central well. Tessa followed, carrying a wooden bucket. She needed to fetch water to clean the slate and to settle the dust that their restless feet had kicked up. As she reached the well, she saw Coulter Hayes was already there, his horse drinking from the trough. He had just finished cranking a full bucket up from the cool depths. He saw her approaching, saw the bucket in her hand, and without a word, he unhooked his own and tipped it, filling hers to the brim. He moved with an unthinking, practical courtesy. As he poured, a little water sloshed over the rim, splashing onto the dry, dusty ground. A few cool drops landed on the back of Tessa's hand, and at the same time, on his. The sudden cold on their sun-warmed skin was a small shock. For a fleeting instant, their eyes met over the bucket. His were the color of a stormy sky, deep and shadowed. He gave a curt nod, a barely perceptible acknowledgement of the shared moment, before turning back to his horse. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice stopping him as he was about to mount. "I believe this is yours." She reached into the large pocket of her apron and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. The cover was scuffed and the spine was cracked, but the title was still visible in faded gold-leaf fables of the prairie. I found it on the road, near my wagon. It must have fallen from your saddlebag. He looked at the book as if it were a ghost. He took it from her, his calloused fingers brushing hers for a second time. The touch was brief, accidental, yet it felt charged with a strange significance. He ran his thumb over the worn cover. "I thought this was long gone," he said, his voice low and rough. "The binding is loose, but the pages are all there," Tessa said, her bookbinder's instincts taking over. "The lettering is quite beautiful." He didn't answer, just stood there holding the small book in his large, capable hand. It looked incongruous there, a delicate object from a world of thought and story held by a man of dust and labor. He gave another short nod, slipped the book into his saddlebag, and swung himself onto Gideon. He rode away without another word. Later that week, while buying supplies at the general store, Tessa overheard two women talking. Their voices were low, but the words carried clearly in the quiet store. "Such a shame about Coulter Hayes," one of them, Mrs. Gable, said, weighing a bag of flour in her hands. "He built that whole house for her. A real house, with glass windows and a proper porch. And she just left, ran off with a traveling theater troupe. They said she couldn't stand the silence out at the dry run." The other woman clucked her tongue in sympathy. "It's a hard life. It takes a certain kind of woman to stay, and it's left him hard, too. He keeps to himself now. Trusts no one." Tessa pretended to be absorbed in examining a bolt of calico cloth, but their words settled in her mind like stones. She thought of the man at the well, his shadowed eyes, his profound silence. She thought of the way he had looked at the book, a flicker of some old, forgotten softness in his gaze. She chose to ignore the women's gossip and listen instead to the quiet, steady beat of her own heart. Back in the converted warehouse, the afternoon sun streamed through the gaps in the walls, illuminating the floating dust. Tessa stood before the blackboard. "Today," she announced, her voice clear and hopeful, "we are going to learn a new word." She turned and, with a fresh piece of chalk, wrote 4 letters in a careful, elegant script, S-T-A-Y. "Stay," she said, tapping the word. "It means to remain in one place, to not leave." She handed out small, personal slates and pieces of chalk. "I want you all to practice writing it." A chorus of scratching sounds filled the room as 20 small hands tried to mimic the shapes she had made. Young Ben's was backward, and Sarah's looked more like a stray twig. A boy in the back dropped his chalk, and it shattered on the floor, sending the children into a fit of giggles. Tessa smiled. In this room, stay was just a word, a game of lines and curves. But outside these walls, she knew, it was a prayer. Night fell on the Dry Run Ranch like a heavy blanket. The world shrank to the small circle of yellow light cast by the lantern on Coulter's kitchen table. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the relentless, maddening squeak of the windmill. Squeak, turn, squeak, turn. It was the sound of his anxiety, the sound of the earth crying out for water. He couldn't sleep. The sound grated on his nerves, a constant reminder of his dwindling resources and the notice posted in town. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, he pushed back his chair, grabbed a handful of old rags, and went outside. He climbed the wooden ladder of the windmill tower, the rungs smooth and worn under his hands. He reached the turbine and, with practiced ease, jammed the rags deep into the axle mechanism. The squeaking stopped. The sudden, profound silence was almost as loud as the noise had been. He stood on the platform, his hand resting on the now silent machine, and looked out at the vast, star-dusted darkness. His eyes were wide open, 2 sleepless points of consciousness in the immense, silent landscape, watching and waiting alongside the wind. In her small room at the boarding house in Sagebrush, Tessa lit a candle by its flickering light. She sharpened a pencil with a small knife and opened a fresh journal. She dipped her pen in ink and began to write a letter. Though she had no one to send it to, it was a letter to herself, to the quiet, hopeful woman she used to be. "They talk of love in poems and songs," she wrote, the pen scratching softly on the paper. "They speak of grand passions and whispered promises. But out here, the land is too vast and the sky too empty for such delicate words. Here, survival is the only poetry that matters. I have come to believe that in harsh places, the simple, stubborn word stay is worth more than the word love. It is a promise made not with the lips, but with the feet. It is the decision to not run when the wind blows and the well runs dry. It is the hardest and most beautiful word of all." She paused, looking at the words she had written, and thought of a quiet man with stormy eyes, a broken-down wagon, and a book of prairie fables. She blew out the candle and sat for a long time in the dark. The water in the remaining pools of the dry run had changed. It was no longer just low. It was sick. A foul, muddy brown color had replaced the murky green, and a smell of stagnant decay clung to the air. Coulter Hayes knelt by the deepest pool, the one he relied on for his cattle. He dipped his fingers in. The water felt thick, silty. It was wrong. He stood and walked to the wooden post he'd driven into the creek bed weeks ago, a crude but reliable measure of his ranch's lifeblood. He pulled his pocket knife, its bone handle worn smooth with use, and opened the blade. He scraped a new mark into the soft wood, a thin, horizontal line indicating the current water level. It was a full inch below the mark he'd made just 2 days prior. The drop was unnatural, too fast for simple evaporation, even under the relentless sun. The creek wasn't just dying, it felt like it was being bled. A sound, a low and desperate chorus of complaint, drew his attention back toward his corral. The calves. Their bellowing was sharp with thirst, a sound that scraped at a rancher's soul. They were bunched against the fence, some rubbing their heads raw against the rough timber, others kicking at the dusty, empty troughs. Their mothers, gaunt and listless, stood nearby, their own ribs showing like washboards beneath their hides. Coulter's jaw tightened. He walked to the well, the mechanism groaning in protest as he cranked the handle. The bucket that came up was only half full. It was the last of the clean water he could draw until the well had time to seep and refill. He carried the heavy bucket to the corral, the water sloshing with each step. He poured it into the main trough. The calves surged forward, a frantic, shoving mass of hide and bone, their muzzles plunging into the shallow pool of water. It was gone in less than a minute. Coulter stood with the empty bucket in his hand, the sound of their renewed, thirsty cries echoing in the oppressive silence. In town, Tessa stood outside the blacksmith's forge, the rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil a steady, industrious heartbeat for sagebrush. Her buckboard, now fitted with a new, sturdy wheel, stood ready. She was paying the blacksmith, a burly man named Gus, whose face was permanently smudged with soot, when 2 other men approached, their boots crunching on the gravel. They were well drillers, their wagon loaded with pipes and strange, heavy equipment. They were talking to Gus, their voices carrying on the dry air. "No use drilling down here," one of them said, shaking his head. "The water table's dropping too fast. Heard someone's put a block on the main spring up in the limestone hills, dammed it right at the source." The other driller spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Ain't legal, but who's gonna stop 'em? That spring feeds half the creeks in this valley. Whoever controls that water controls everything." Tessa froze, Gus's receipt fluttering in her hand. The limestone hills, they rose to the north, a pale, bony spine of rock that overlooked the entire basin, including the lands of the Dry Run Ranch. The next day in the schoolhouse, the heat was a physical presence, making the air thick and hard to breathe. Tessa unrolled a large sheet of butcher paper on the floor. "Today," she announced to the children gathered around her, "we are going to be cartographers, map makers. She looked directly at young Ben, the fence mender's son. He was a quiet boy, but he knew the land better than any of them, his bare feet having traced every rabbit trail and dry wash for miles. "Ben," she said gently, "can you draw for me the little creek that runs out of the limestone hills, the one they call the Dry Run? Show me where it starts and where it goes." Ben's face lit up. He took the piece of charcoal she offered and knelt on the paper. With hesitant, then increasingly confident strokes, he began to draw. A child's map, full of disproportionate landmarks and wavering lines. But it held a truth that no surveyor's chart could. He drew the creek, a long, snaking line. He drew Coulter's ranch house, a small square with a triangle for a roof. Then, at the very top of the paper, where the creek began, he drew a series of jagged humps for the limestone hills. And with a final, decisive stroke, he drew an arrow pointing to the source of the water. The arrow's tip landed squarely in a section of land he'd shaded in. "That part belongs to Mr. Crowell," Ben said, his small voice certain. "My PA says he leased it for grazing, but no one's ever seen a single cow up there." That evening, as dusk painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and faded orange, Tessa walked the dusty path out to the Dry Run. She found Coulter reinforcing a section of fence, his movements methodical, his face grim. She carried a small, cloth-bound notebook and Ben's map, rolled tightly in her hand. She waited until he finished hammering a post into the hard ground before she spoke. He looked up, his expression unreadable in the fading light. He wasn't surprised to see her. Little seemed to surprise him. Tessa unrolled the map, weighting its corners with stones. "This is what the well drillers are saying in town," she said, her voice low and steady. "And this is where the creek begins." He crouched down, his tall frame folding easily, and studied the child's drawing. His finger traced the path of the creek, from the shaded land down to the small square that was his home. He was silent for a long time. When he finally stood up, he shook his head. "It's Crowell's land," he said, his voice flat. "Leased or not, he has a right to it. Stirring this up, it's just looking for trouble. I have enough of that." He turned to go back to his work, a man retreating into the shell of his own quiet resignation. Tessa stepped in front of him, blocking his path. She held out the small notebook she carried. "The truth is thirstier than we are. Mr. Hayes." He stopped, his gaze falling to the notebook in her hand, then rising to meet her eyes. Her expression was not pleading, but resolute. It was a look that offered not comfort, but a challenge. In the sagebrush saloon, the air was thick with smoke and the smell of stale beer. Elias Crowell sat at a corner table, a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses in front of him. Across from him sat a man in a dusty but well-tailored suit, a representative from the Transcontinental Railroad. A contract lay open on the table between them, its pages filled with dense, legal script. Crowell picked up a pen, his movements smooth and satisfied. "So, we are agreed," he said, his voice a low purr of triumph. "Once I've acquired the titles to the entire grassland corridor, including the Hayes property, you will have your direct route through the valley." The railroad man nodded. "The price is contingent on you delivering the full, contiguous parcel. We don't want a patchwork." Crowell smiled. "A mere formality." He dipped the pen into the inkwell. As he did, a man standing at the bar turned slightly, his movement catching the lantern light. He was dressed in a long, black duster, despite the heat. His face was lean and shadowed by a low-brimmed hat. A pistol was tied low on his hip, its handle worn smooth. He watched Crowell with an unnerving stillness. The banker signed his name with a flourish. The man in black pushed away from the bar and walked to the table. "Mr. Crowell," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "You wanted to see me." Crowell looked up, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "Ah, Pike, yes, have a seat. There's a small matter of encouragement I'd like to discuss." Pike didn't sit. He simply looked at the signed contract, then at Crowell. He reached over, picked up the banker's pen, and dipped it into the inkwell. As if testing the ink for himself, he didn't say a word. At that moment, a sudden gust of wind slammed against the saloon, rattling the window panes in their frames. The lanterns flickered wildly. From the other side of the room, Coulter Hayes, who had come in for a quiet drink he now regretted, pushed his chair back and stood up. He threw a coin on the bar and walked out, not looking at anyone. As he stepped onto the boardwalk, his shadow stretched long and thin before him in the moonlight, a solitary figure moving against the encroaching darkness. Tessa stood at the door of her empty schoolhouse. The night was alive with the sound of the wind, a restless, whispering voice that seemed to be telling a story of its own. She could feel a change in the air, a tension that had nothing to do with the weather. She ran her fingers along the spine of a book resting on a shelf near the door, the worn leather a familiar, comforting texture. She thought of the desperation in the sound of the thirsty calves, of the stubborn set of Coulter's jaw, of the dark ink on Crowell's contract, a story she couldn't read but whose ending she could guess. She had offered a challenge, but words in a notebook were not enough. Not here. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She knew what she had to do. The truth was up there, in the limestone hills, at the source of a dying creek, and she would not let him go looking for it alone. The moon was a sliver, a pale, scarred thumbnail against a black velvet sky. It offered just enough light to turn the limestone hills into a ghostly landscape of skeletal shapes and deep, menacing shadows. The rocks, bleached by sun and time, glowed with a faint, bone-white luminescence. It was a dead landscape, silent and ancient. Through this spectral world moved two small figures, their progress marked by the single, bobbing yellow eye of a storm lantern. Coulter Hayes held the lantern high, its light casting their shadows long and distorted behind them. Tessa Rowan walked close behind, her hand sometimes brushing against his back for balance on the uneven ground. They followed the ghost of the creek, a dry, winding scar of gravel and cracked earth that led them steadily upward. The only sounds were the ones they made, the crunch of their boots on the loose scree, the brittle snap of a dry twig underfoot, the sharp crackle of night insects being crushed beneath their heels. The air was thin and cold at this elevation, a stark contrast to the baked heat of the daytime plains. Each breath they took was visible, a small, white plume of steam that blossomed and vanished in the chilly air. They moved in silence, a shared and necessary quiet that was part of the landscape itself. There were no words for this kind of work, this kind of searching. There was only the steady rhythm of their footsteps, a two-beat pulse of determination against the immense, sleeping silence of the hills. Coulter walked with a long, ground-eating stride, a heavy crowbar resting on his shoulder. He moved with a mountain lion's economy of motion, placing each foot with practiced certainty. Tessa, more accustomed to the flat, predictable terrain of towns and reading rooms, found the climb arduous. Her lungs burned, and her legs ached. But she refused to slow down. She matched his pace. Her focus narrowed to the pool of light at her feet and the steady, reassuring presence of the man in front of her. She watched the way the muscles in his back moved beneath his shirt, the way he scanned the path ahead, his head constantly turning, listening, sensing. He was a part of this wildness, and she was an intruder. Yet he had allowed her into his silent world without question. He had simply appeared at the edge of town as dusk was falling, seen the resolve in her eyes, and given a single, curt nod. That was all that had passed between them. It was enough. They had been climbing for over an hour when the smell hit them. It was a sharp, acrid scent, unnatural in this clean, cold air. The smell of fresh-cut pine and something else, something chemical and cloying. Tar. Coulter stopped so abruptly that Tessa almost ran into him. He held the lantern higher, swinging its beam in a slow arc. The light caught on something ahead, something that didn't belong. It was a wall, a crude, dark barrier erected across the narrowest point of the ravine, where the spring should have been bubbling up from the earth. They had found it. It was a simple, brutal piece of engineering, a series of thick wooden stakes, their tops freshly splintered from the force of a sledgehammer, had been driven deep into the ground, spanning the width of the creek bed. Woven between the stakes and covering them completely was a thick, heavy canvas, the kind used for wagon covers. The canvas was black and glistening, coated in a thick layer of sticky, foul-smelling pine tar to make it waterproof. It was a crude dam, but brutally effective. Behind it, the water from the underground spring, choked off from its natural course, would be pooling, creating a hidden reservoir, while downstream, the land and its people were left to wither. Coulter lowered the crowbar from his shoulder, its iron tip thudding softly on the rocky ground. He ran his hand over the rough wood of the nearest stake. It was solid, deeply embedded. Tessa stepped forward, her weariness forgotten, replaced by a cold, rising anger. She reached out and touched the canvas. It was stiff and tacky. She was wearing a pair of old leather work gloves, but she stripped one off, wanting to feel the truth of the thing with her bare hands. She found a loose corner of the canvas and pulled. It resisted, held fast by the stakes and the sheer, dead weight of the water behind it. She pulled harder, gritting her teeth. With a sucking, tearing sound, a section came free. A thick, black glob of tar clung to her fingers, sticky and foul. While she worked at the canvas, Coulter wedged the tip of the crowbar into the earth at the base of the first stake. He set his feet, planting them wide for leverage, and threw his entire weight against the long iron bar. The muscles in his arms and shoulders knotted into hard ridges. The crowbar groaned. The stake held firm. He repositioned his grip and tried again, a low grunt of effort escaping his lips. This time, the stake shifted, a slight, almost imperceptible movement, accompanied by the sound of splintering wood and protesting earth. He worked in a focused, rhythmic silence. Pry, shift, pry again. Each movement was a small act of war against the injustice of this barrier. It was then that they heard it, a sound that did not belong to the night. It was the distinct, rhythmic clatter of shod hooves on stone, coming from further up the trail. Not one horse, but several, moving at a steady, deliberate pace. They were coming closer. Coulter immediately let the crowbar fall. He grabbed Tessa's arm, his grip firm but not rough. Behind that rock, he hissed, his voice a low, urgent whisper. He shoved her toward a large, flat slab of limestone that lay a few yards away, its bulk creating a deep pocket of shadow. "Stay down. Don't make a sound." He didn't wait for an answer. As she scrambled into the darkness behind the rock, he picked up the lantern and moved away from the dam, walking quickly and deliberately in the opposite direction, deeper into the ravine. He was making himself the target, drawing their attention away from the evidence, away from her. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer. 3 riders emerged from the darkness, their figures silhouetted against the pale sky. They were dark, menacing shapes. The lead rider was the man in the black duster, Pike. The 2 men with him were rough-looking, their faces indistinct in the gloom. They reined in their horses, their eyes fixed on the single point of light moving away from them. "Well, well," Pike's dry voice cut through the stillness. "Looks like we have a trespasser." He raised a hand, and in it, Tessa saw the dark gleam of a revolver. The night exploded. The gunshot was a deafening crack that echoed off the rock walls, a violent violation of the immense silence. A spray of bright orange sparks erupted from a rock just inches from where Coulter had been standing a second before. He had thrown himself to the ground the instant Pike raised his arm. He rolled, coming up on one knee behind the meager cover of a small boulder, his own pistol already in his hand. He didn't fire at the men. He fired at the rock wall high above their heads. The bullet ricocheted with a high-pitched scream, a sound designed to terrify. The horses, already skittish, reacted instantly. One of them reared, whinnying in panic, its rider cursing as he fought to control it. Another shot rang out from Pike's men, then another. The bullets whined through the air, chipping fragments of stone from Coulter's cover. He was pinned down, outgunned, hidden in the shadows. Tessa's heart hammered against her ribs. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. But beneath the fear was a hot surge of fury. She looked at the lantern, still sitting on the ground near the dam where Coulter had left it. An idea, desperate and reckless, formed in her mind. She crawled on her hands and knees, the sharp rocks digging into her palms, until her fingers closed around the lantern's wire handle. It was still lit, its flame burning steadily within its glass globe. She rose to a crouch, her eyes fixed on the dark shape of the lead rider. With all the strength in her arm, she swung the lantern in a wide arc and let it fly. It sailed through the air, a small, fiery comet against the darkness. It wasn't a perfect throw, but it was good enough. The lantern shattered against the rock face just behind and to the side of Pike. Burning oil splashed and ignited, and for a single, brilliant moment, a curtain of flame flared up, illuminating the scene in a harsh, revealing light. In that flash of fire, Tessa saw Pike's face clearly for the first time. He was no hardened gunfighter. His face was pale, his features pinched. There was a pen smudge on his cheek. He looked like a clerk, a man more comfortable with ledgers and inkwells than with violence and darkness. He flinched from the light, his expression one of startled anger rather than cold command. The momentary distraction was all Coulter needed, but something else was happening. The fire from the lantern had landed perilously close to the tar-soaked canvas. A small lick of flame touched the sticky black surface, and the tar instantly ignited. A line of fire raced across the dam. At the same time, Coulter's final, desperate heave on the crowbar had done its work. The main stake, weakened and stressed, finally gave way. There was a deep, groaning crack of splintering wood, and then a roar. The dam burst, a solid wall of dark, churning water, held captive for weeks, exploded out of the ravine. It was a living, breathing thing, a force of nature unleashed. It surged forward with incredible power, sweeping away the burning remnants of the canvas, the splintered stakes, everything in its path. The sound was immense, a deafening chorus of liberation that drowned out everything else, the panicked shouts of the men, the terrified whinnying of the horses, the echo of the last gunshot. For one brief, glorious moment, the only sound in the world was the jubilant, roaring song of the water returning to its rightful course, a living pulse beating once more in the heart of the stone-dead hills. The first light of dawn was a fragile, pearlescent thing, spilling over the eastern plains and chasing the long, blue shadows from the hollows. It found Coulter and Tessa as they made their way back to sagebrush, not on the main road, but through the sage and scrub, following the newly resurrected creek. The sound of the water, a cheerful, gurgling music, was the only thing that filled the silence between them. They were a study in exhaustion and grim resolve. Their clothes were torn and stained with mud and tar, their faces smudged with soot, and their hands raw. Coulter carried the heavy, splintered stake over his shoulder, and Tessa held a bundled section of the foul-smelling, tarred canvas as if it were a sacred relic. They didn't walk like victors, but like soldiers returning from a battle that was only the first in a longer war. Sagebrush was just beginning to stir. The smell of wood smoke from kitchen stoves mingled with the clean, cool air of the morning. A few early risers stopped and stared as the pair walked down the main street, their disheveled appearance a stark contrast to the quiet dawn. They didn't stop at the sheriff's office or the bank. They walked directly to the small, white-steepled church that served the town as its spiritual heart and, on occasions such as this, its legal one. The town's judge, Josiah Harris, was a former circuit rider who had settled in Sagebrush more out of weariness than ambition. He was a man whose face was a roadmap of long years spent weighing the sins and squabbles of men. He was already in the church, sweeping the floor himself, when Coulter and Tessa entered. He looked up, his broom stilled, and his expression shifted from mild surprise to deep concern as he took in their appearance and the strange objects they carried. Word traveled fast in a town the size of sagebrush. Within 20 minutes, the church was no longer empty. People filed in, drawn by a current of unspoken urgency, filling the wooden pews. They were ranchers with worried eyes, shopkeepers, the blacksmith, the stable owner. They were the community, a collective body, now serving as jury and witness. Elias Crowell arrived last, flanked by his nervous clerk. He looked immaculate in a clean suit, his face a mask of calm, civic concern, though a muscle twitched in his jaw. Pike was not with him. Judge Harris convened the impromptu court not from a judge's bench, but from behind the simple wooden pulpit. There was no gavel, only the weight of his presence to command order. "Coulter, Miss Rowan," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I trust there's a good reason you've brought a piece of offense and a dirty tarp into the house of the Lord before breakfast." Tessa stepped forward. She did not speak. Instead, she walked to the open space before the pulpit and unrolled the section of canvas. The thick black tar gleamed in the light slanting through the church's tall, plain glass windows. Then Coulter stepped up beside her and drove the splintered end of the wooden stake into the floorboards with a single, resonant thud. The evidence sat there between them and the judge, stark and irrefutable, a heavy, acrid smell. The chemical stench of the pine tar began to fill the church, overpowering the familiar scents of old wood and beeswax. It was the smell of a crime, an ugly, invasive odor in a sacred space. A low murmur rippled through the pews. "This," Tessa said, her voice clear and strong, though she was trembling with exhaustion, "is what was stopping the Dry Run Creek at its source, on Mr. Crowell's leased land." All eyes turned to the banker. Crowell did not flinch. He gave a small, almost dismissive shrug, a gesture of condescending reasonability. "Judge, I'm as shocked as anyone by these theatrics. Last night, my man, Mr. Pike, reported to me that he found these two trespassing on my property. They were vandalizing a structure I had erected." He paused, letting the word vandalizing hang in the air. "I was simply protecting my assets from unknown trespassers and, I might add, from the natural erosion that is silting up the spring." He presented it as a matter of prudent land management, his tone suggesting they were the ones who had acted rashly. The simplicity of the lie was breathtaking. It was Tessa who answered, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the church. She took a step closer to the pulpit, her gaze fixed on Crowell, but her words were for everyone. "Who were the vandals, Mr. Crowell?" she asked, the question sharp as a shard of glass. "The stream, which has flowed freely since God first made these hills, or the children in this town who need that water to drink?" The question landed with the force of a physical blow. It reframed the entire argument. This was no longer about property lines and lease agreements. It was about life, about the future, about the small, smudged faces of the children who were, at that very moment, likely waking up in their beds. The murmuring in the pews grew louder, shifting from curiosity to something harder, something more aligned with the woman standing before them. Crowell's face, for the first time, lost its placid composure. A flicker of cold fury showed in his eyes. Judge Harris held up a hand for silence. He looked from the evidence on the floor to the cold anger on Crowell's face, and then to the fierce, weary resolve in Tessa's. He was a man of the law, and the law demanded process. "Elias, do you deny that this barrier was diverting the primary water source for the dry run?" "I deny any malicious intent," Crowell said smoothly. "I was engaged in land improvement. Mr. Hayes should have spoken to me if he had a concern." "There's nothing to speak about," Coulter said, his voice a low rumble. It was the first time he had spoken, and the sound carried a weight that made people lean forward to listen. "You stole the water, plain and simple." Judge Harris sighed. His gaze swept over the assembled townspeople, their faces a mixture of suspicion and allegiance. He knew this was a fuse that, if not handled carefully, could ignite the entire community. This is not a matter we can settle with accusations in a church at sunrise. The law requires facts, measurements, proof. He looked at Coulter and Tessa. I will grant a 3-day injunction. The dam will remain down. In those 3 days, I will ride up to the spring myself, along with the sheriff and anyone else who cares to witness it. We will measure the flow of the water. We will examine the county records and verify the historical water rights associated with the dry run. He then looked directly at Crowell. And you, Elias, will not interfere. Your men will remain off that northern pasture. Is that understood? It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. A stay of execution. Crowell gave a tight, thin-lipped smile and a curt nod. Of course, Judge, I am a man who respects the law. His eyes, however, told a different story. As the meeting broke up and people began to file out, their voices a low hum of speculation. Crowell moved close to Pike, who had materialized silently at the back of the church. The banker's voice was a venomous whisper, lost in the general noise. This isn't over. That teacher, she's a problem. I want you to teach her a lesson, a permanent one. Make her understand what happens when outsiders stick their noses where they don't belong. Pike's lips curved into a slow, chilling smile. It was a smile that promised pain, a smile that relished the prospect of the work to come. Coulter and Tessa were among the last to leave the church. Stepping out into the full light of the morning, the air felt thin, and the adrenaline that had sustained them through the night was beginning to fade, leaving a deep, bone-aching weariness in its place. They stood for a moment on the church steps, the town now bustling around them, yet they were isolated in a bubble of shared experience. Coulter looked down at her. Her face was pale beneath the grime, but her eyes were still bright with defiance. He felt a protective urge so fierce it startled him. This wasn't her fight. She had stumbled into it, and now she was at its very center, a target for a man like Crowell. You should go, he said, his voice low and rough. You can still leave. Take your wagon and head east before this gets worse. There's no shame in it. It was the most he had ever said to her at one time, and the words felt clumsy and inadequate in his mouth. He was offering her an escape, the only gift he thought he had to give. Tessa looked up at him, at his shadowed eyes and the deep lines of exhaustion etched around his mouth. She saw the concern behind his blunt words. She thought of her small classroom, of the children's eager faces, of the words she had written on the blackboard. She gave a small, tired smile. I came to Sagebrush to teach Mr. Hayes, she said softly. The word stay doesn't have legs. It can't walk away on its own. Someone has to be here to give it meaning. A sound from the churchyard broke the moment. The church bell, which also served as the town's school bell, began to ring, its clear iron notes pealing out over the rooftops. It was her signal. A group of children, including young Ben, came running toward the church, their faces bright with a morning energy. They chased each other in a circle around the rusty, discarded water bucket that lay near the steps, their laughter a pure, uncomplicated sound in the tense morning air. They were the reason. They were the stakes. Tessa watched them, and a look of profound, unshakable resolve settled on her face. She would not run. She would stay. The idea for the water fair started as a whisper in Tessa's classroom and blossomed into a full-throated communal effort. It was an act of quiet rebellion, a way for the town to fight back with the only weapons they had: flour, sugar, and community spirit. The main street of Sagebrush, usually a drab expanse of dust, was transformed. 2 long trestle tables were set up, draped in mismatched but clean tablecloths. They were soon laden with the humble treasures of Prairie Kitchen's misses, Gable's famous apple pies with their latticed crusts, jars of plum jam that glowed like jewels in the afternoon sun, dense loaves of sourdough bread, and trays of simple sugar cookies cut into the shapes of stars and moons by the children. Tessa moved through the small crowd, a spot of color and energy in her best blue dress. She coordinated the efforts, her teacher's voice now repurposed to direct the placement of a pie or to praise a child for carefully counting out change. Her students were her willing deputies, their faces scrubbed clean and alight with the importance of their task. Young Ben, his shyness forgotten, was in charge of a large jug of lemonade. Sarah, her pigtails tied with scraps of ribbon, carefully wrapped slices of cake in wax paper. The proceeds, collected in a large pickle jar, were for a new rope and bucket for the town well, a small, practical goal that represented a much larger hope, the belief that together they could endure. Coulter Hayes arrived not with a pie, but with his wagon, loaded with raw timber and tools. He was not a man for fairs or socials, but he had heard of their purpose, and he brought the contribution he knew how to make. While the townspeople bought and sold their wares, he worked under the hot sun at the edge of the square, near the main cattle trough. With a silent, focused intensity, he began constructing a series of long, temporary troughs, extending the reach of the town's water supply. The sharp, clean scent of newly sawn pine mingled with the sweet smell of baking from the fair. The rhythmic rasp of his saw and the solid thud of his hammer provided a steady, industrious counterpoint to the chatter and laughter of the crowd. He was building something, not just out of wood, but out of a shared need. When the troughs were finished, he rode out and returned with his own small herd of cattle, their ribs showing, their heads low with thirst. He was joined by 2 other small ranchers who had also brought their animals to town, trusting in the promise of this communal effort. The cattle smelled the water. A low, desperate moaning rumbled through the herd, a sound of profound, animal need. They surged forward, their horns clacking, their heavy bodies jostling for position. As they drank, plunging their muzzles deep into the cool water, they churned the dry ground into a muddy soup. A thick cloud of red dust rose, mingling with the steam from their wet hides, creating a pungent, earthy perfume of damp leather, dust, and livestock. From the shadows of the alley between the general store and the assayer's office, Pike watched. His face was a mask of cold contempt. This display of community, of hopeful resilience, was an offense to him, an obstacle to the simple, profitable cruelty his employer had planned. He had been given an order to teach the teacher a lesson. He saw the cattle, bunched together, nervous and thirsty. He saw the crowd, their attention focused on the fair, an opportunity. His eyes scanned the area and settled on a large, heavy stack of empty freight crates piled high against the wall of the general store, held in place by a single, thick rope. He slipped from the alley, moving like a wraith, unnoticed in the bustle. With a quick, vicious slash of the knife he carried, he severed the rope. The sound was not a gunshot, but it was just as effective. The rope snapped with a loud crack, like a bullwhip. For a split second, there was silence, and then the top crates, their support gone, toppled and crashed to the boardwalk with a splintering, echoing boom. For the cattle, already on edge, the sound was a trigger. A single steer, a big, long-horned animal, threw its head up, its eyes rolling in terror. It let out a panicked bellow and bolted. The terror was contagious. It shot through the herd like a lightning strike. The low moaning turned into a roar of panic. The jostling mass exploded into a stampede. The world dissolved into chaos. It was a river of brown hide, a forest of sharpened horns, a rolling thunder of hooves that shook the very ground. Women screamed and grabbed their children, scrambling for the safety of the boardwalks. Tables were overturned, pies and jars of jam smashing on the ground. The cattle, blind with fear, poured into the main street, a torrent of unstoppable, terrified flesh. Coulter had been coiling a rope when the crates fell. He reacted instantly. There was no thought, only the deep, ingrained instinct of a man who had spent his life reading the language of animals. In a single, fluid motion, he leaped onto the top rail of the nearest corral fence, balancing on the narrow perch like an acrobat. He put 2 fingers to his lips and let out a whistle, a sound so sharp and piercing it cut through the din like a blade. He ripped off his jacket and began waving it. a small flag of defiance in the face of the charging herd. He was turning them, trying to redirect their blind panic away from the center of town and toward the open space at the end of the street. Tessa had been knocked to the ground when the crowd surged. She got to her feet, her heart hammering, her mind racing. She saw Coulter on the fence, a solitary figure trying to command a tidal wave. She saw the direction he was trying to push them. At the end of the street was a wide secondary gate, leading out to the open plains. It was closed, but there was a pulley rope, designed to allow a rider to open it from horseback. Her hands, so recently accustomed to the delicate work of handling books and chalk, now reached for the thick, coarse rope. It was heavy, stiff. She pulled with all her might, her muscles screaming in protest, her arms shaking from the strain and the terror. The heavy gate began to move, groaning on its hinges, opening a path for the tide of cattle. "Miss Rowan!" a small voice shouted. It was Ben. He was holding a coiled lariat, a rope he used to practice with at home. His face was pale, but his eyes were steady. He pointed toward the front of the herd. "That one, the big one. If you can turn him, the others will follow." The lead steer, a massive animal with a wide rack of horns, was ignoring Coulter's attempts to divert it. It was heading straight for the narrow gap between the blacksmith shop and the schoolhouse. If it went through there, the whole herd would follow, trampling everything in their path. Tessa saw it, too. "Ben, now!" she screamed. Ben ran forward, a small, brave figure against the terrifying backdrop of the stampede. He swung the rope once, twice, and then let it fly. The loop, thrown with a child's desperate strength, wasn't perfect, but it was enough. It fell short of the steer's head, but it landed on the ground directly in front of its charging hooves. The sudden appearance of the snaking rope was enough to break the animal's panicked charge. It skidded, its hooves digging furrows in the dirt as it tried to swerve. Its momentum carried it sideways, directly toward the gate Tessa was struggling to hold open. Time seemed to slow, to stretch. Tessa saw the glint of the sun on the steer's polished horn, a sharp, curved scythe of bone. She saw its wild, terrified eye, a black pool of pure panic. She tried to scramble back, but her feet tangled, and she stumbled. The world tilted. She was falling, directly into the path of the skidding, 1,000-pound animal. An arm, solid as oak, wrapped around her waist. She was jerked backward with a force that knocked the breath from her lungs. Coulter! He had leaped from the fence and covered the distance in 3 long strides. He pulled her tight against him, using his own body as a shield as the steer thundered past, its horns scraping against the wooden gate with a high-pitched shriek of tortured wood. The sound was inches from her head. The rest of the herd, following their now diverted leader, poured through the open gate and out onto the plains, their panic finally finding release in the wide, open space. The thunder of their hooves began to recede, replaced by a ringing silence. The dust began to settle, a fine red mist that coated everything. Coulter's arm was still locked around her. Tessa could feel the hard, hammering beat of his heart against her back. Or perhaps it was her own. She could feel the tremors of adrenaline still coursing through him. Slowly, he loosened his grip but didn't let go entirely, his hand resting on her arm as if to assure himself that she was real, that she was unharmed. She turned to face him. His face was inches from hers, streaked with sweat and grime. A drop of his sweat fell from his temple and traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She could taste the salt of it on her lips. She looked into his eyes, and for the first time, the shadows were gone. In their place was a raw, unguarded emotion she couldn't name. It was more than relief. It was a profound, terrifying fear not of the stampede, but of what might have been. They stood there for a long, silent beat. The world shrunk to the small, charged space between them. No words were spoken. None were needed. The chaos had stripped away all pretense, leaving only a stark and undeniable truth. The silence was finally broken by the sound of a child's sob of relief. The spell was broken. The town began to stir again, people emerging from doorways, their face pale with shock. The herd was a receding cloud of dust on the horizon. The danger was over, but in the quiet aftermath, as Coulter finally let his hand drop from her arm, their hearts were still racing, galloping to a rhythm that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with what had just passed between them. From the shaded porch of the saloon, untouched by the dust and the panic, Elias Crowell watched. He took a slow, deliberate sip from his glass of whiskey. He had seen it all, the chaos, the fear, the moment when Hayes had pulled the teacher from the path of the steer. A slow, thin smile spread across his face. Pike had failed to teach his lesson, but he had succeeded in revealing a weakness. The rancher and the teacher, it was a complication, but every problem had a solution. He lowered his glass, his eyes narrowed to cold, calculating slits, already planning his next move on the board. The late afternoon sun slanted through the high, dusty windows of the grain warehouse, laying long, golden bars across the floor. The chaos of the morning had receded, leaving behind a profound and heavy quiet. The town had cleaned up the last of the smashed pies and broken jars. The overturned tables had been righted, and life had returned to its usual, measured pace. But the air was different. The silence in the schoolhouse was not the peaceful, scholarly quiet of a day's lessons completed. It was a stillness born of shock, a hollow space where the thunder of hooves still echoed in memory. Tessa stood alone in the center of the room, a solitary figure in the vast, empty space. She was sweeping, the rhythmic scrape of her broom a small, methodical sound against the immense quiet. But her movements were automatic, her thoughts elsewhere. She was still seeing the wall of horns and hide, still feeling the solid, unyielding strength of Coulter's arm pulling her from the path of death. She could still taste the salt of his sweat on her lips. On the large, scarred blackboard, the words she had taught the day before remained. Stay. The letters, written in her neat, careful hand, seemed to mock her now. It was a word that was so simple to write, yet so impossibly hard to live. The chalk dust from the children's earlier efforts formed a faint, ghostly halo around it on the floor. It was a word that now carried the weight of a near tragedy, the scent of fear, and the undeniable charge of a shared moment of life or death intimacy. She heard the footsteps on the boardwalk outside before she saw him. They were heavy, measured, and familiar. She stopped sweeping, her hands tightening on the smooth wood of the broom handle. The door creaked open, and Coulter Hayes stepped inside, bringing the deep shadows of the late afternoon in with him. He filled the doorway for a moment, his broad shoulders blocking the light. He was still covered in the dust of the stampede, his clothes rumpled, his face etched with a weariness that went bone deep. He had come, she knew, to check on her, though he would never say the words. It was not his way. He closed the door behind him, and the room was plunged back into a dim, cathedral-like quiet. He didn't speak, just stood there, his presence a solid, undeniable fact in the empty room. His gaze swept over her, a quick, assessing look that missed nothing, from the slight tremor in her hands to the smudge of dirt still on her cheek. The silence stretched, thick and alive with unspoken things. It was a different silence from the one she had shared with him in the hills. That had been a silence of shared purpose. This was a silence of aftermath, of consequence. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the core, that what had happened in the street had been no accident. The severed rope, the timing, the way Pike had simply vanished from the scene, it was a message, a warning. And by pulling her from the path of the steer, Coulter had placed himself squarely beside her as a recipient of that message. He was no longer just a rancher fighting for his water. He was now the man protecting Crowell's other problem, the teacher. She leaned the broom against the wall and walked slowly toward him until she was standing just a few feet away. She could see the fine lines around his eyes, the dark stubble on his jaw. She could smell the dust and the sun on him. She had to offer him the same thing he had offered her. She had to give him the chance to be safe. Her voice, when she spoke, was a near whisper, a sound so soft it was almost lost in the vast, quiet room. "You can still leave." The words hung in the air between them, an echo of his own advice to her on the church steps. It was not a dismissal. It was a release. It was an act of profound and painful generosity. It was her telling him that she understood the price of standing with her, and that she would not hold him to it. Coulter stood as if turned to stone. For a long moment, he did not move, did not even seem to breathe. His face, already a mask of shadow and stoicism, became utterly unreadable. He had spent a lifetime walking away, from a home that held too many ghosts, from a town that offered only pity and gossip, from a future that had dissolved into the dust of a stagecoach heading east. Leaving was what he knew. It was his deepest, most practiced instinct. It was the armor that had kept his solitary heart from breaking completely. And now, this woman, with her clear, steady eyes and her quiet courage, was offering him that armor back. She was offering him the well-worn path of retreat. All he had to do was turn and walk out the door. He could go back to the dry run, back to his silent, lonely fight, and no one would blame him. His hand, which had been hanging loose at his side, began to move. It rose slowly, deliberately, not with the quick efficiency of a man used to work, but with a strange, heavy grace. His fingers touched the brim of his hat. It was a stained and battered thing, soaked with years of sweat and rain, bleached by 1,000 suns, and coated in the fine red dust that was the very substance of his life. It was his shield, the shadow that hid his eyes, the barrier he kept between himself and the world. His fingers closed around the brim. He lifted it from his head, his dark, unruly hair falling across his forehead. It was the first time she had ever seen him without it. The absence of the hat was a revelation. It stripped away the last of his defenses, leaving his face open, vulnerable, exposed in the dim light of the schoolhouse. His eyes, no longer shadowed, were deep and dark, and filled with a lifetime of unspoken sorrow and a flicker of something new, something fierce and determined. He held the hat in his hands for a beat, his knuckles white, and then, with a small, almost imperceptible exhalation of breath, he let it go. It didn't make a sound. It fell through the still air and landed softly in the dust at her feet, its wide brim settling just inches from the toe of her worn leather boots. It lay there between them, a dark, silent circle on the floor. It was an offering, a surrender, an anchor. His voice, when he finally spoke, was rough, scraped raw with an emotion he had long since buried. "I've left enough things," he said. He looked directly into her eyes, and the world seemed to stop. "Today, I'm staying." Tessa felt the words like a physical touch, a warmth spreading through her chest. A slow, fragile smile touched her lips, a trembling curve of relief so profound it felt like pain. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden, blurring his image into a soft, hazy shape. They were tears of gratitude, of terror, of a joy so fierce and unexpected it was almost unbearable. He was staying. He was choosing this fight. He was choosing her. The moment, so fragile and so perfect, was shattered. A heavy, deliberate footstep creaked on the boardwalk just outside the door. Then another. They were not the footsteps of a friend. Before either of them could react, the door was thrown open with a violent bang, slamming against the interior wall. Pike stood in the doorway, a black silhouette against the dying light. The long barrel of his revolver was level, steady, and pointed directly at them. The setting sun glinted off the dark, oiled metal, a single, malevolent star. His face was a mask of cold amusement, his lips twisted into a sneer. "Staying," he said, his voice a dry, mocking rasp that slithered into the quiet room. "That's a touching sentiment." He took a slow step inside, the gun never wavering. But you've got it all wrong. Tonight, fire is going to teach you how to leave." In an instant, Coulter moved, placing himself between Tessa and the gun. It was a pure animal reflex, his body becoming a shield without a single conscious thought. He pushed her back, his hand flat against her stomach, a solid wall of muscle and bone. Tessa's hand flew out, not to push him away, but to find him, to connect with him. Her fingers closed around his wrist, beneath her trembling grasp. She could feel the thick, steady beat of his pulse, a strong, rhythmic thrum of life under the skin. It was a beat of calm, controlled power in the face of the gun, a silent, defiant rhythm that said, "We are here. We are together." Pike's sneer widened. He took another step into the room, the hammer of his pistol clicking back with a sound that was unnaturally loud in the sudden, deathly silence. Down on the floor, forgotten in the sudden rush of terror, lay the hat. It was no longer just a piece of worn leather and felt. It had become something more. It was a line drawn in the dust. It was a promise made without paper or ink, a contract sealed not with a signature, but with the simple, undeniable weight of cowhide and dust and the word of a man who had finally decided to stop running. The first sign was not the light, but the smell. It stole into the deep sleep of midnight, a sharp, acrid odor of burning pine and something thicker, something chemical, tar. It was a scent of deliberate malice. Coulter was on his feet before he was fully awake, the smell triggering an alarm deeper than any bell. He threw open the door of his small ranch house, and the world was bathed in a terrifying, flickering orange light. Hell had come to the dry run. The large hay barn, the one he had built with his own hands in a time of greater hope, was engulfed in flames. The fire was not a natural, creeping thing. It roared, a hungry beast devouring the dry, seasoned timber with an explosive hunger. Great. Churning clouds of black smoke billowed into the night sky, shot through with geysers of brilliant orange sparks. Against this backdrop of infernal light, 3 figures on horseback were silhouetted, dark and malevolent, Pike and his men. They watched their work for a moment, then turned their horses and melted back into the darkness, leaving the fire to deliver their final message. Chaos erupted. People spilled from the ranch house and the bunkhouse Tessa, and a half-dozen families, ranchers and their wives and children who had come to the dry run seeking safety in numbers after the stampede. They stood frozen for a second, their faces pale and horrified in the firelight. "The pump!" Coulter's voice was a roar that cut through the panic. "Get the hand pump to the creek!" He didn't wait to see who followed. Already sprinting toward the shed where the equipment was stored, he emerged a moment later, hauling the heavy, wheeled hand pump, its iron frame seeming impossibly heavy. Tessa was already moving, her mind snapping into a strange, focused calm. While some of the men ran to help Coulter with the pump, she organized the women and older children, forming a bucket brigade. But her primary concern was the youngest. "Ben Sarah Jacob," she shouted, her voice sharp and clear over the roar of the fire. She began a roll call, her teacher's instinct taking over, needing to account for every small soul entrusted to her care. She pointed to the small root cellar, its earthen mound a safe distance from the barn. Everyone there now count heads. She needed them safe, away from the smoke and the falling embers. Coulter and 2 other ranchers, their faces grim masks of sweat and soot, wrestled the pump to the edge of the newly flowing creek. The water, so recently a source of hope, was now their only weapon. They dropped the intake hose into the rushing current and began to man the long wooden handles, their bodies falling into a desperate, piston-like rhythm. Pump, heave, pump, heave. Water surged into the long canvas fire hose. Tessa grabbed the heavy brass nozzle, another rancher helping her brace against the expected pressure. The hose, flat and lifeless a moment ago, writhed like a snake as it filled, becoming a stiff, bucking tube. Water erupted from the nozzle in a powerful, arching stream. It was a pathetic defense against the raging inferno, a single stream against a sea of fire. But it was something. It was a stand. The heat was a physical blow, a solid wall that seared the lungs and scorched the skin. The roar of the flames was a deafening, all-consuming sound, punctuated by the sharp crack of splitting timbers and the high, terrified screaming of the cattle trapped in the main corral adjacent to the barn. Then the wind, the fickle, ever-present wind of the plains, shifted. It had been blowing from the south, pushing the smoke away from them. Now, it swung around, coming from the west, a hot, dry gust that fanned the flames like a blacksmith's bellows. A river of fire flowed sideways, and with a terrifying whoosh, the long, shingled roof of the barn ignited. Burning shingles, like fiery leaves, were lifted on the wind, sailing through the air and landing on the roofs of the other outbuildings. The fire was spreading. The cattle, their eyes white with terror, began to crash against the corral fences, their bellows a sound of pure, animal agony. They would be cooked alive. "The North Gate!" Coulter yelled, his voice raw. He pointed, not looking away from his work at the pump. "Tessa, the North Gate! Get them out!" Tessa understood. The North Gate opened onto the wide, empty pastures, away from the burning buildings. She dropped her grip on the nozzle, letting the other rancher take the full force, and ran, her skirts flying, toward the far end of the corral. The gate was secured with a heavy wooden beam. Her hands, raw and blistered, struggled with the latch. It was stuck. She threw her shoulder against it, once, twice, grunting with the effort. The wood was hot to the touch. With a final, desperate heave, the beam lifted from its bracket. The gate swung open with a groan, a dark mouth opening into the safety of the night. The cattle surged through it, a stampede not of panic, but of escape, a living torrent pouring into the darkness. She ran back to the hose, the faces of the children in the cellar a driving image in her mind. She and Coulter fought side by side, moving as one organism. He aimed the stream of water, not at the heart of the fire that was a lost cause, but at the roof of the house, dousing the spreading embers, creating a wall of steam and water. The imagery was stark, elemental, the angry, consuming orange of the fire against the clean, life-giving silver of the water, the roar of destruction against the steady, determined hiss of their defense. Steam billowed up where water met flame, great white clouds that momentarily obscured the stars. It settled on them, covering their hair and faces in a fine, cool mist, a baptism in the midst of hell. Through the shifting curtains of smoke and steam, Coulter saw him, Pike. He had circled back and was sitting on his horse by the far fence line, watching, a satisfied spectator at the destruction he had wrought. But the arrival of the deputy sheriff and two armed townsmen, riding hard from sagebrush, had clearly changed his plans. It was time to leave. Pike spurred his horse, jumping the fence in a clean, athletic movement. He was escaping. "No," Coulter breathed, the word a guttural growl. He dropped his grip on the pump handle and started to run. His long legs ate up the ground, his heavy work boots pounding a furious rhythm on the hard-packed earth. He vaulted the same fence Pike had jumped, his movements filled with a cold, desperate rage. Pike saw him coming. He was 100 yards away, his horse already at a canter. He was too far. He was getting away. Tessa saw it too. Lying near the well was a coiled lariat, dropped by one of the ranchers in the initial panic. She scooped it up. It felt heavy, alien in her hands. But she had watched the ranch hands, had seen Ben practice. She ran to the fence line, trying to get ahead of Pike, to cut off his angle of escape. He was going to ride right past her. She swung the rope, the loop awkward and unbalanced, but she didn't try for a fancy throw. She waited until his horse was almost upon her, its hooves thundering, its breath hot in the night. Then, she didn't throw the loop up, she threw it down, a low, desperate cast aimed not at the rider, but at the horse's churning legs. The rope snaked out, a living thing in the firelight. It caught, The loop tangled around the horse's front legs, a fatal, binding knot. The animal went down hard, its scream of pain and surprise a terrible sound. Pike was thrown clear, tumbling head over heels, his long duster flying. He landed with a bone-jarring thud, the breath knocked out of him. He came up spitting dirt and fury, his revolver already in his hand. He was wild, his face contorted in a mask of rage. He fired, not aiming, just shooting wildly into the darkness in the direction of the woman who had brought him down. The bullet missed her by a yard, but it slammed into the thick corner post of the corral right beside her head. The wood exploded, showering her cheek with a spray of sharp, stinging splinters. She cried out, more in shock than in pain, her hand flying to her face. That was all Coulter needed to see. A sound, a roar of pure, protective fury, was ripped from his throat. He covered the last 20 yards in a blur of motion and crashed into Pike like a force of nature. There were no punches thrown. It was a tackle, a raw, physical collision of bodies. They went down in a tangle of limbs, Coulter's greater weight and righteous fury giving him the advantage. He wrenched the gun from Pike's hand and threw it into the darkness. He pinned him to the ground, his hands on Pike's throat, the desire to end it, to squeeze the life from this man who had threatened everything. A burning, primal urge. Then he felt a hand on his shoulder. "That's enough, son," a calm voice said. It was the deputy. "Let the law have him." Coulter looked up, his chest heaving, his vision clearing. He looked down at the terrified, gasping face beneath him, and the red haze of his anger began to recede. He got to his feet. The deputy hauled Pike up and slammed him against the fence. There was a sharp, metallic clicking sound, clean and final in the night air. As the handcuffs were snapped onto his wrists, it was the sound of a lock turning, the end of a dark and ugly refrain. Slowly, the battle with the fire turned, with more men from town arriving. They contained it, saving the house and the other buildings. The great hay barn was a total loss, a blackened, skeletal ruin against the dawn that was now beginning to break. The fire was no longer roaring. It was breathing. The great pile of hay and timber had become a massive bed of glowing red embers, pulsing softly in the pre-dawn light, exhaling their last heat. Coulter walked over to Tessa, who was leaning against the well, a cloth pressed to her bleeding cheek. He gently took her hand away, his thumb brushing away a smudge of soot. The cut was shallow, a thin red line against her pale skin. All around them was the smell of smoke and wet ash, the sight of destruction. But beneath it all, another sound was beginning to assert itself as the world grew quiet. It was the sound of the creek, the water they had freed, still running, still speaking its endless, quiet language of life and persistence. It had not been silenced. The following morning, the church was fuller than it had ever been for a Sunday service. There was no sermon, no hymns, only a heavy, expectant silence. Every bench was packed. People stood 3 deep along the back wall, their faces a mixture of grim curiosity and sober concern. The entire town of Sagebrush was present, a silent, collective witness. They had seen the pillar of smoke from the dry run in the night, had heard the rumors, and had come to see the truth, whatever it might be, laid bare in the light of day. At the front, before the simple wooden pulpit, Judge Harris sat at a makeshift table. His face was grave, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual. To one side stood Coulter and Tessa. She had a clean bandage on her cheek where the splinters had cut her, a small, white mark of the violence that had transpired. Coulter stood beside her, his posture straight, his face an unreadable mask. But his presence was a solid, unwavering statement. On the other side of the table stood Elias Crowell. He was impeccably dressed, as always, but his usual smooth composure had cracked. A fine sheen of sweat glistened on his upper lip, and his eyes darted nervously around the room, unable to find a friendly face. A few feet away, Pike sat on a small stool, flanked by the deputy. His hands were cuffed in front of him. His face was smudged with soot, and a singed patch on his duster spoke of his close encounter with the fire. He stared at his bound hands as if he had never seen them before. Judge Harris cleared his throat, and the sound was unnaturally loud in the hushed room. He opened a large, leather-bound ledger. "We are here," he began, his voice slow and deliberate, "to bring light to the dark events of these past few days. This is not a formal court of law. It is a community seeking an accounting. We will proceed with simple questions and expect simple truths." He looked first at Tessa. "Miss Rowan, you and Mr. Hayes brought the first evidence to this town's attention. Please, tell us again what you found." Tessa did not speak. Instead, she stepped forward and, on the wide, open space of the floor, she unrolled the large sheet of butcher paper, Ben's map, in the solemn adult space of the church. The child's drawing looked both touchingly naive and profoundly powerful. The wavering charcoal lines, the lopsided square representing Coulter's ranch, the jagged humps for the limestone hills, it was a simple, honest rendering of the world as a child saw it. "This map was drawn by one of my students," Tessa said, her voice clear and steady, reaching every corner of the room. She knelt, her finger tracing the snaking line of the creek. He drew the dry run from its source to Mr. Hayes's land, and here, her finger stopped on the shaded patch of land at the very top, is where the spring begins. This is the land that my student and his father and everyone in this town knows to be the North Pasture, the same land that records show Mr. Crowell leased from the county 3 months ago. Her finger then moved to a small X that Ben had drawn. "And this is the exact point where we found the dam, the point where the water for this valley was stolen." A low murmur went through the crowd. It was one thing to hear rumors. It was another to see it laid out so plainly, in the innocent hand of a child. Judge Harris looked at Pike. "Mr. Pike, you were apprehended last night at the Dry Run Ranch during the fire. You were armed. You discharged your weapon. You are charged with arson and attempted harm. Before we get to that, I have a simpler question. Were you present at the source of the dry run 2 nights ago?" Pike didn't look up. He continued to stare at his cuffed hands. The silence stretched. The deputy gave him a slight nudge. Pike flinched. He finally raised his head, his eyes empty. "Yes," he said, his voice a dry, defeated rasp. "I was there." "And were you responsible for constructing the barrier across the spring?" the judge pressed. Pike swallowed hard. His gaze flickered for a fraction of a second toward Elias Crowell. It was all the answer anyone needed. But the judge waited for the words. "I was," Pike whispered. Then, his voice gaining a slight edge of bitter resentment, he added, "But I was following orders. I was doing a job." "Whose orders? Mr. Pike?" Judge Harris's voice was like stone. Pike looked directly at the banker then. All the fight was gone from him, replaced by the simple, selfish need to save his own skin. "His," he said, nodding his head toward Crowell. "I did what Mr. Crowell paid me to do, block the creek, scare off the rancher, and deal with the teacher." The murmur in the crowd grew into an audible gasp. This was it, the direct accusation. Crowell's face went white, the color draining from it as if a plug had been pulled. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly on the wooden floor. "That's a lie. A desperate lie from a common criminal," he sputtered, his voice high and strained. "I hired him for security. I was only protecting my property. That is my right." It was the same line he had used before, but this time it sounded hollow, pathetic. It was the desperate bleat of a man who had run out of lies. The deputy stepped forward. He was holding the splintered, tar-soaked stake from the dam in one hand. In the other, he held a piece of paper. "Judge," the deputy said, his voice calm and factual. "This here is the stake they pulled from the creek. And this here," he held up the paper, "is a receipt from the general store, dated 6 weeks ago. It's for the purchase of 10 yards of heavy canvas and 2 buckets of pine tar." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. The signature at the bottom, authorizing the charge to the bank's account, is Elias Crowell's. He placed the receipt on the table in front of the judge. It was the final piece, the physical proof, the nail in the coffin. A profound silence fell over the church. It was deeper and heavier than before. It was a silence of judgment. In that quiet, you could hear the frantic buzzing of a single fly trapped against a window pane. Every eye in the room was on Elias Crowell. Every rancher who had ever feared foreclosure. Every shopkeeper who had ever paid his exorbitant interest rates. Every man and woman in that room now understood. They saw the full, ugly shape of his greed, and they saw how it had led from signed papers and legal threats to a secret dam, to a stampede, and finally, to the terror of a midnight fire. He had not just threatened one man's livelihood. He had threatened the soul of their community. Judge Harris looked at the receipt, then at the map, then at the singed man in cuffs. He looked at Coulter's stoic silence and Tessa's bandaged cheek. Finally, he looked at Elias Crowell, who had sunk back into his chair, a man utterly defeated not by a court of law, but by a roomful of his neighbors. "Elias Crowell," Judge Harris said, his voice resonating with a quiet, final authority. "This community finds that you have acted with malice and deliberate intent to cause harm." He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The court of public opinion is a powerful thing in a town like this, but the law has its own remedies. He delivered his verdict, his sentences falling like a stonemason's hammer. First, the water rights of the Dry Run Ranch are hereby affirmed in perpetuity. Any and all barriers are to be considered a criminal offense. Second, you will pay a fine sufficient to cover the complete reconstruction of Mr. Hayes's barn and the replacement of all lost hay and livestock. Third, and here, a collective breath was held. The loan on the Dry Run Ranch held by your bank is hereby restructured. The payment deadline is extended by 1 full year, and will from this day forward be tied not to the calendar, but to the coming of the seasonal rains. A man cannot be asked to pay with what the land itself has not yet given him. It was more than justice. It was wisdom. It was a verdict that understood the rhythms of the land they all lived on. Coulter did not smile. He didn't pump his fist in victory. Winning didn't feel like a triumph. It felt like the simple, heavy return of something that should never have been taken away. He turned his head and looked at Tessa. Their eyes met across the small space that separated them. He gave her a single, slow nod. It was a nod that said everything. It acknowledged her courage, their shared struggle, the terrible risk and the quiet victory. It was a nod that confirmed a truth they had forged together in darkness and in fire. As the meeting broke up and people began to file out into the bright morning sun, their voices now a buzz of relief and quiet satisfaction, the children from Tessa's school, who had been waiting anxiously outside, saw her emerge. They swarmed her, their small hands grabbing at her dress, their faces alight with joy. Young Ben looked up at her, his eyes shining. "Miss Rowan," he shouted, his voice high and clear. "You taught us the word, and it was true." Another little girl, Sarah, chimed in, her voice full of childish wonder. "The word stay really did stay." They ran ahead, chasing each other toward the schoolhouse, their laughter echoing in the street. Tessa watched them go, a real, unburdened smile finally reaching her eyes. She looked over at Coulter, who was watching them too, and in the bright, clear light of that new morning, they both knew that the lesson had been learned by everyone. The June rains came not with the fury of a storm, but with the gentleness of a long-held promise finally kept. It began in the night, a soft, persistent drumming on the tin roof of the ranch house, a sound so long prayed for that at first it seemed like a dream. Coulter woke and lay in the darkness, just listening. It was the sound of life returning, the sound of a debt being paid by the sky. By morning, the world was transformed. The oppressive red dust was gone, washed clean from the air, replaced by a deep, earthy scent of wet soil and thirsty sage. The land, which had been a uniform, weary brown, now had a soft, green haze to it as the dormant grasses drank and stirred to life, and the dry-run creek, no longer a ghost of its former self, ran full and clear from bank to bank, its surface a perfect, unbroken mirror reflecting the soft, gray sky. In the weeks that followed, a quiet, industrious peace settled over the valley. The land began to heal, and so did its people. The raw, blackened skeleton of Coulter's barn was cleared away, and with the help of his neighbors, the foundation for a new, smaller one was laid. But the real work was in the small, daily acts of recovery. Coulter spent his days repairing the things that had been neglected during the fight for water. He climbed the windmill tower, no longer to silence its anxious squeak, but to methodically dismantle, clean, and oil every moving part. He worked with a patient, focused calm, his hands, so recently clenched in anger, now moving with a craftsman's gentle precision. The windmill, when he was finished, turned with a smooth, silent grace, its blades spinning freely in the clean, rain-washed wind. In town, in the quiet afternoons after her students had gone home, Tessa undertook her own careful act of restoration. She sat at her small desk in the schoolhouse, the scent of fresh rain blowing in through the open door, and worked on the small, battered copy of Fables of the Prairie. She carefully separated the loose pages, her slender fingers cleaning away the dirt and grit from the road where it had fallen. She mended tears with thin strips of paper and a pot of paste she had made from flour and water, with a bookbinder's loving skill. She stitched the pages back together and glued a new strip of sturdy leather along the spine. When she was done, the book was no longer broken. It was scarred, its cover still scuffed, its pages still foxed with age. But it was whole again. The line of fresh, dark glue along its new spine shone in the afternoon sun, a testament to the healing power of patient, caring hands. The spirit of cooperation that had sparked at the water fair now burned with a steady, enduring flame. The town decided, in one of Judge Harris's informal church front meetings, that they would build a new, permanent community trough, larger and more efficient than the old one. It was a project that belonged to everyone. The ranchers brought the timber, the blacksmith forged the iron fittings, and the storekeeper donated the nails. On the day of the raising, it seemed the entire town turned out. The men worked together, their saws and hammers creating a rhythmic, communal music. The women brought food, spreading blankets in the shade and creating a feast of roast chicken, fresh bread, and cold buttermilk. At midday, everyone stopped to eat. A blacksmith with hands black with soot passed a slice of bread to a rancher whose hands were white with flour. Tools were laid aside, and for an hour, there were no separate ranches or businesses, only a community, sharing a meal under the wide, benevolent sky. One afternoon, a new sign appeared in the window of the sagebrush bank. It was a simple, hand-painted sign, and it read, "For sale, Crowell." It turned out, could not endure a town where he was no longer feared. He could not stand the polite but distant nods that had replaced the deferential greetings he was used to. He had been defeated not by force, but by a quiet, collective turning of the back. A few days later, a stagecoach heading east stopped to pick him up. No one came to see him off. The wooden sign in his bank window, already hanging slightly crooked, swayed in the breeze. A quiet, final lesson in the true cost of greed. On a bright, clear afternoon, Coulter walked into the empty schoolhouse. The room was filled with the scent of chalk dust and drying wildflowers the children had picked. Tessa was at the blackboard, preparing the next day's lesson. He didn't say anything, just walked over to the wall where a series of wooden pegs had been hammered for the children to hang their coats and hats. Hanging on one of those pegs was his own hat. He had left it there the day of the confrontation with Pike, and neither of them had mentioned it since. It had become a silent fixture in the room, a quiet placeholder. He took the hat down from the peg. It felt strange and light in his hands. He slowly, methodically, began to brush the dust from it, not the fresh dust of a day's work, but the old, ingrained dust from the stampede, from the floor where it had fallen. His thumb traced the crease in its crown, the worn curve of its brim. Tessa had turned from the blackboard and was watching him, her expression soft and questioning. He held the hat, this symbol of his long solitude, and looked at her. He thought of all the years he had hidden behind it, all the goodbyes he had let it witness. He thought of the future, a thing he had not dared to consider for a very long time. "If one day you decide you want to leave," he said, his voice low and steady, "I'll open the gate for you myself." It was the greatest promise he could make. It was not a promise to hold her, but a promise to set her free. It was a promise that acknowledged her own strength, her own will. He would not be a cage. Tessa's eyes shone, but she did not cry. She took a step closer to him, her gaze never leaving his. "And if one day," she answered, her own voice a soft, unwavering echo of his own, "you decide you want to leave, I will hold on to the word stay." It was the perfect response. It was not a chain, but an anchor, a promise that if his old ghosts ever came calling, if his instinct to run ever surfaced, she would be there to remind him of the man he had become. He didn't put the hat back on. Instead, he hung it carefully back on its peg on the schoolhouse wall. It belonged there now, a part of this new life he was building. Later, they stood together by the new community trough, its fresh pine timbers smelling sharp and clean in the warm air. Their shoulders touched. It was a small, simple point of contact, but it felt as profound and binding as any vow. A group of calves, their hides sleek and their bellies full, were drinking deeply from the trough, their thirst finally and truly slaked. Coulter and Tessa watched them, a comfortable, companionable silence settling between them. The great, violent struggles were over. The fires were out. The floods had passed. What was left was this, the quiet work of living, the shared view of a peaceful afternoon. It was enough. It was everything. The clear, bright sound of the school bell rang out, calling the children back from their recess. Tessa turned, a smile touching her lips. "I have to go," she said softly. "They're learning their numbers." She squeezed his arm gently and then walked toward the schoolhouse, her steps light and sure. Coulter watched her go. He watched as she greeted the children at the door, herding them inside with a gentle word and a warm smile. A slow, genuine smile spread across his own face, a sight as rare and as welcome as the June rains. He turned and started the walk back to the dry run, back to his own work. He didn't feel lonely. He felt anchored, and the clean, sweet scent of the new, wet grass seemed to rise from the earth and follow him all the way home. On the porch of the empty schoolhouse, hanging quietly on its peg, the battered Stetson remained. It was a silent testament, a promise made of dust and sweat, of fire and water, a promise to stay, kept safe and waiting for the next season and the one after that. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and consider hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners just like you.